So you're nearing retirement or going into retirement, you have a $500,000 portfolio and you're wondering, how much income can you expect from this $500,000 portfolio every year in retirement? Well, we're going to dive into an example case study of just that. Here we have Mark and Julia. Today, Mark and Julia are 57 years old. Mark and Julia are looking to retire in the next couple of years. Today, Mark has a salary. He makes $120,000 a year. Julia makes $80,000 a year. For the sake of this example, we're just going to use the Social Security estimates. Mark puts $6,000 away into his 401k, and Julia puts $4,000 per year away into her 401k. Mark is matched at 5% and Julia is also matched at 5%. Pre-retirement, they have monthly expenses in the amount of $7,750 per month. Going into their net worth, we can see here that they have a total net worth of $1.26 million. We're going to look at their investments here. Aggregated in their investments, they have a $500,000 total portfolio between Mark and Julia. Mark's 401k has $225,000 in it. Julia's 401k has $170,000 in it. And then they have a joint taxable account with $105,000. Going into their goals, they would like to retire in 5 short years at the age of 62. If possible, they would like to spend $5,500 a month in retirement. We're going to assume that at Mark's retirement, both of their retirement, they start traveling in the amount of $6,000 every 2 years, and this is going to last until the age of 85. At that point, they just aren't going to travel as much. We're also going to assume that they purchase a new car every 10 years in retirement, starting at retirement and going to the end of their plan. It is important to note that both of these goals, all of these goals, I should say, are adjusted for inflation. Now, going into their retirement analysis, we can see here that as of today, they have a 98% probability of success. And if we look at the end of their plan, we can see here that at the age of 90, at the end of their plan, they'll have about $1.9 million in ending assets. So a couple things we want to look at. The primary focus of this video is to figure out, hey, based on that $500,000 portfolio, how much income can we expect in retirement? So the first thing I want to look at is their investments. And as we can see today, pre-retirement, they have an allocation of 68% across all of their accounts into equities and 32% into fixed income. We're assuming a hypothetical annual rate of return of 8.7% with a standard deviation of 11%. And so thinking about retirement, would it make sense to carry this as essentially a growth portfolio into retirement? Maybe not. So the first thing we want to look at is we want to look at how their pre-retirement allocation, the allocation we just went over, differs from what a retirement allocation may look like. When you think about how you withdraw assets in retirement, we are going to use what we call the traditional withdrawal strategy. We're going to assume that Mark and Julia pull first from their taxable account, then their tax deferred accounts. And if it makes sense later down the road, if they have, let's say they do conversions and they actually get a Roth IRA or create a Roth IRA, finally it would be from those tax-free accounts, those Roth IRAs. But for the sake of this example today, we are assuming that first they pull from that taxable account and then from their tax deferred accounts, those 401ks. And so in retirement, would it make sense to have a growth portfolio? Well, we know that for Mark and Julia, we are going to be taking some money from our portfolio to fund our retirement. So if we go down here, maybe it makes more sense to have a moderate portfolio. For the sake of this example, we assume a 60% equity allocation and a 40% fixed income allocation. We can see here that this lowers our annual return and it also lowers our standard deviation. So going into our retirement analysis, we are going to adjust our retirement allocation for Mark and Julia to that moderate portfolio. And as we can see here, adjusting our retirement allocation to a moderate portfolio doesn't do anything to the probability of success on our retirement analysis. We do have $325,000 less in ending assets than our current plan, but again, we are picking up a more moderate portfolio focused on stability, as we know we will need to pull income from our portfolio for retirement. Going into our retirement details, we can go to the withdrawal rate of the proposed plan, and we can see here that early on in retirement, our withdrawal rate is substantially high, in excess of 12, 14%, depending on the year. And then once we start collecting Social Security, assuming we collect at full retirement age, we can see that for several years, we actually aren't pulling anything from our portfolio. And then we'll have those RMDs that kick in at the age of 75. And then we can see here our withdrawal rate increases throughout our entire plan, throughout the rest of the plan. So let's go back to our retirement analysis here. If we look at our retirement analysis, again, we're assuming that Mark and Julia retire at the age of 62, but they don't collect Social Security until full retirement age. So there's a 5-year income gap there. If we go into our cash flow summary, we can see here that from 2030, from 62 until 67, they have that income gap, no income flows. Yet they still have the same expenses plus the goals of buying that new vehicle, of traveling, etc. And so we see here that they have substantial negative net flows. So what should we look at here? Well, maybe it makes more sense for Mark and Julia to actually collect Social Security at the age of 62 upon retirement. So let's go into their Social Security, let's adjust that to as early as possible, and let's see how this impacts their plan. As we can see, it drops our probability of success to 95%, but we actually have more in ending assets here. We can see that we actually have $300,000 more in ending assets than our current plan. And we're assuming that in retirement, again, we have that moderate allocation, not our current allocation. If we adjust this to our current allocation, we can see how this actually increases those median ending assets even more to $740,000. So let's adjust this back to moderate, and let's go to our withdrawal rate to see what this does, what impact this has on how we're pulling assets out. Going into our retirement details, we can see here that our withdrawal rate is much more stable throughout our entire retirement here. We can see that, yes, at the age of 62, we still have a higher withdrawal rate, but then we see this level out, and then we have our goals of buying that new vehicle that create that spike in our withdrawal rate. But still, for the lion's share of retirement, we can see here that we have a sub 6% withdrawal rate. And so our withdrawal rate here for Mark and Julia starts to look much better than before. Why? Because we have more stability here in our portfolio, and we aren't relying on our portfolio for income early on in retirement like we were previously. So going back to the cash flows, for Mark and Julia, something that they could think about is from today until retirement, they have substantial spend from unsaved cash flows. This is where they could look at this plan and say, hey, look, we have in excess of $30,000 a year. We could save that to further increase our assets upon retirement, whether that's putting more away into a 401k or putting that into a taxable account. That way, from 2030 at the age of 62 upon retirement to RMD age at the age of 75 in 2043, these negative net flows we see here, well, if we are able to save early on before retirement, those spend from unsaved cash flows, we could more easily subsidize these negative net flows that we see here. Another thing to consider for Mark and Julia is we see here, starting at the age of 75, we're going to have substantial distributions. We can see that the total inflows are going to be $150,000 plus, and we can see here that, again, we're going to have big spend from unsaved cash flows because we're required to take out a certain amount of money every year from those 401ks, from those tax deferred accounts. So for Mark and Julia, one thing that might make sense for them is looking into Roth conversions. How could they move assets from this tax deferred account into a tax-free account so that maybe they don't have to take those RMDs? And those assets could actually grow tax-free in a Roth account. So looking at this, looking at their plan for Mark and Julia, how much money could they take out in retirement, how much could that $500,000 portfolio produce? Well, if we go into our investments here and we look at our portfolio, we are assuming that they have that moderate allocation in retirement at 8.2%. And for Mark and Julia, if we go back to their retirement analysis and go into their withdrawal rate, we can see here that on any given year, they're going to pull out, call it, sub 6% until later on in retirement. Early on in retirement, they're pulling out about 2.3, 2.4%, up to 3%, and then that gradually increases. So for them, pulling out that $5,500 per month in retirement makes sense. And in fact, they could actually increase that depending on what their goals in retirement are. So let's just go through and see what it looks like if we increase this to $7,000. How does this impact their plan? Well, we can see here that updating their retirement monthly expense to $7,000 from $5,500, at the end of their plan, they'll have about $416,000. So yes, at the end of their plan, we can see here that they have over $400,000. But a couple things to be mindful of is, how does the market play into this? What if we go into a market downturn? So those are things to be mindful of. What happens if instead of $7,000, we decrease this to $6,500, which is still $1,000 over our initial retirement monthly expense? We can see here at the end of the plan, they have about $1.5 million in ending assets. And so this starts to look very doable for both Mark and Julia. Sure, it's $500,000 less than the current plan, but they're able to spend more in retirement. They're able to have a moderate portfolio allocation, and they're able to collect Social Security at the age of 62. And so when you think about how much income can your $500,000 portfolio produce for you every month in retirement, it's important to remember and think about your other income sources, your fixed retirement expenses, and how you are allocated within your portfolio and what your withdrawal rate is. If you keep these things top of mind and strategically plan for your income, your expenses, your investment strategy, and your withdrawal strategy in retirement, then you can get creative around how much you're able to pull from your portfolio. For Mark and Julia, retiring and spending $6,500 per month is doable for them. This is something that they could reasonably consider and do for their retirement. Looking at this, if they wanted to increase this to $7,000, this might be where they start thinking about things a little bit differently. Maybe in certain years, it could make sense for them. But what if we go into a market downturn? What if there's other factors that negatively impact their portfolio? This would be something that they would want to consider, as at the end of the plan, we saw that they had about $400,000 in ending assets. So depending on their long-term retirement goals, yes, it could make sense for them, or it might be something that they look away from and instead defer to that $6,500 per month retirement expense. Guys, if you want to create a financial plan just like this, to strategically plan for your own retirement, to figure out how much income can your portfolio provide you throughout your retirement, then I invite you to click the link in the description, create your free DIY retirement plan, and you'll be on your way in no time. Thank you so much, and until next time, bye-bye.